A year out from Birmingham 2027, Harry stood at the official countdown announcement and called it the beginning. Confident, smiling, cameras rolling, every visual cue of an event that was fully on track. That's the version that made it into every headline covering the announcement. Here's the version sitting in the spreadsheets instead.
Prince Harry and Invictus. His games could get cancelled.
Now this is seismic.
A funding gap north of £33 million, 15 months until the opening ceremony. One board vice chairman already gone, the previous game's largest corporate sponsor walked away entirely, an entire country's government funding pulled, and a £26 million government pledge that's actually only released about $3 million of it so far. Right now, 500 veterans from 23 separate nations are actively training for this specific event, building their bodies and their competitive routines towards something they genuinely believe in. Most of them, by any reasonable estimate, almost certainly have no real idea what the underlying financial picture actually looks like behind the scenes of the organization they're representing.
It is such an honor to be here tonight, celebrating all of you and supporting my husband in the Invictus Games, which he founded 4 years ago.
So tonight, I want to sit with the real question here. Not the tabloid drama. Not whether Harry and Meghan should be involved. The actual question. What happens to those 500 athletes if this money genuinely doesn't materialize in time? Because when you go through the Invictus Games Foundation's own filings with the UK Charity Commission, publicly available documents that almost nobody actually reads in full, a pattern shows up that the foundation hasn't publicly explained. Let's start with that £26 million government pledge, because the way it's been reported doesn't match how it actually works.
First, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to the Invictus Games 2025 Organising Committee for their sheer passion and hard work in making these extraordinary games possible.
When the UK government announced its commitment to Birmingham 2027, that headline figure traveled everywhere, cited in press releases, repeated by supporters, used constantly as reassurance whenever budget concerns came up. The phrase attached to it was simple: government-backed. And that commitment, made through the Office for Veterans Affairs, is genuinely real and on the record. What almost nobody explained clearly is what happens after the headline. That $26 million isn't sitting in an account somewhere, guaranteed regardless of anything else. It's structured as a conditional release. The government unlocks money in tranches, specifically as the foundation demonstrates it's raised sufficient private funding alongside it. Government money follows private money here. It doesn't replace it. As of mid-2026, only $3 million of that $26 million has actually been released. $23 million, close to 90% of the headline figure, remains locked behind a fundraising threshold the foundation hasn't yet cleared.
Adversely affected by the ongoing toxic and poisonous personnel saga of Harry and Meghan.
That's not a small procedural detail. It fundamentally changes what government-backed actually means in this specific context. A lot of veterans training under the Invictus banner, plus a lot of the press coverage around this event, have been operating under the assumption that government funding has this covered. The actual structure of the agreement tells a very different story. Now put the private fundraising picture next to that. Birmingham 2027 currently has 11 confirmed corporate sponsors. Vancouver 2025 had 44. The combined estimated cash contribution from Birmingham's 11 sits around £4 million, and several of those contributions are partly in services rather than direct cash.
Invictus Games might not make it to their next chapter, and this time the crack is not coming from an online petition.
Individual donations, according to people familiar with the foundation's fundraising operation, are described as close to non-existent. Run the actual math. $3 million released from the government pledge, roughly $4 million in corporate contributions, against an estimated total event budget of £40 million covering athlete logistics, venues across the city, security, accommodation, ceremonies, and broadcast infrastructure for competitors from 23 countries. That's a shortfall over £33 million, with 15 months until the opening ceremony. Neither the foundation nor the Office for Veterans Affairs has publicly explained how that gap gets closed or what happens if fundraising targets simply aren't met before the remaining tranches unlock. Birmingham City Council, which put in tens of millions to secure hosting rights, carries no obligation to cover the difference. The $26 million everyone reaches for as reassurance is, in practice, a conditional promise sitting behind fundraising performance the foundation hasn't demonstrated it can actually deliver.
Reporting that Invictus itself is losing sponsors, headline backer Boeing among them.
Stay with me, because the story of why Birmingham only has 11 sponsors instead of something closer to 40 starts specifically with Boeing. Vancouver's 44 corporate partners were anchored by two co-presenting sponsors: ATCO, the Canadian infrastructure company, and Boeing, one of the largest defense and aerospace corporations on Earth. That combination gave Vancouver real institutional weight, the kind of corporate association that makes smaller sponsors feel confident joining the list. Birmingham has 11 total. That's not simply a smaller version of the same event. That's a fundamentally different category of event. In 2023, Boeing announced what it publicly described as a long-term partnership with the Invictus Games Foundation. Not a quiet arrangement, but positioned deliberately as a sustained, multi-year commitment. Exactly the kind of announcement meant to reassure other sponsors that serious money had confidence in the organization.
There is a petition live on the internet right now demanding that Harry be removed from the Invictus Games.
Looking closer at the actual timeline, that partnership was publicly described as extending through 2026. Birmingham 2027 sits just one calendar year outside that window. Boeing has since confirmed it won't be sponsoring Birmingham. Whether that gap reflects a precise technical boundary or whether 2026 was always understood internally as a graceful exit point, Boeing hasn't explained publicly. What's documented is simply the outcome. The co-presenting sponsor of the last games isn't returning for the next one. If this level of detail is useful to you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging into filings most coverage never actually opens.
No, Tom Bow is observing the damage being done to the veterans. That's why he spoke out.
Here's why Boeing's exit matters beyond the obvious dollar figure. When a company of that size and profile leaves a partnership, it doesn't happen quietly internally. It generates legal reviews, PR assessments, internal memos asking why Boeing walked and whether that reasoning applies to everyone else still at the table. Every remaining sponsor's corporate affairs team starts asking some version of the same question. What did they know that we don't? That's the domino effect that never shows up in any official statement but is understood by anyone who's actually worked in major event sponsorship. A headline exit doesn't just remove one partner's money. It creates permission for everyone else to review their own commitment with fresh scrutiny. The result: 11 sponsors where there should realistically be closer to 40. Of those 11, only Deloitte has been publicly confirmed at the official partner level. And sources familiar with the arrangement note, a portion of that specific contribution is structured in professional services rather than direct cash, meaning the actual cash injection is smaller than the partnership headline suggests.
A growing scandal involving Prince Harry and his last remaining genuine charity project, the Invictus Games.
Now let's talk about Australia, because this is where the story stops being purely about sponsorship and starts being about something considerably more pointed. When a government pulls funding from a program, the first useful question is what else was in that same budget. If everything got cut across the board, the withdrawal is simply a budget story. Difficult but explainable, a consequence of wider pressure with no particular targeted meaning. That's genuinely not what happened here. In its 2026 federal budget, the Australian government confirmed it would not be renewing a $9 million commitment to Invictus Australia. Presented quietly, moved past quickly, no extended commentary attached. But look at what surrounded that specific decision. The same budget allocated an additional $14 billion in defense spending over the following 4 years. The same budget directed more than $770 million in new funding specifically toward veteran welfare, rehabilitation programs, mental health services, transition support. Australia didn't cut veterans. Australia significantly increased veteran support across multiple programs while specifically and separately removing its funding from Invictus alone. That's not an austerity decision. That's a targeted one. And a targeted decision at that scale from a country that had been a genuinely significant contributor requires an actual reason.
And fights for the veterans, this, that, and the other. But oh, no. He's really proud to be Prince of England, right?
The context that sharpens this considerably is what happened during Harry and Meghan's Invictus-branded visit to Australia. The trip was characterized as private travel connected to the Games. What emerged afterward was that security arrangements reportedly drew on resources that weren't entirely privately funded. questions surfaced about how much taxpayer-funded security infrastructure had actually been used during a trip described publicly as private. Those questions were never fully and publicly resolved. The Australian government and sections of the Australian public were left without a clear account of how Invictus-branded travel had been conducted, at least partially on their soil and at least partially at their cost, with limited transparency about what had actually been used versus reimbursed. The $9 million withdrawal sits inside that specific context. Australia has historically been one of the strongest participating nations in Invictus, in athlete numbers and competitive performance both. A government-level withdrawal doesn't automatically stop Australian athletes from competing, but it removes a meaningful financial contribution, and it signals publicly that a major allied nation made a deliberate institutional choice to distance itself, sending its own message to every other potential funder watching closely.
We want answers? Well, guess what? Veterans, they're knocking on Az's door and Meg's door. Knock, knock.
A country adding $14 billion to its defense budget while simultaneously cutting $9 million from a veteran-facing event isn't making a financial calculation. It's making a statement. You'd think, at minimum, the host city itself would be standing on stable financial ground. It genuinely is not. Birmingham is the UK's second-largest city, and in September 2023, it became the site of the largest local authority financial failure in British history. The council issued a Section 114 notice, the formal declaration that a local government can no longer balance its budget, functionally as close to municipal bankruptcy as UK law allows. The collapse came from three things arriving at once: a structural deficit of £87 million annually that had been accumulating unresolved, an equal pay liability from predominantly female council employees systematically underpaid relative to male counterparts that had grown to £760 million and had been known internally for years without adequate action, and a technology project. An Oracle software upgrade originally budgeted at £19 million that had, by the time the failure became clear, exceeded £100 million. Add that Birmingham had hosted the 2022 Commonwealth Games the year before this collapse, a genuinely successful event that cost the city approximately £184 million, generated real economic activity and positive coverage, and also left a significant financial strain still being absorbed when the Section 114 notice landed.
Obviously, it's not about the veterans themselves, but the toxic influence of these narcissists that crave to remain relevant at all costs.
Birmingham technically exited formal bankruptcy in February 2026 and is now working toward its first balanced budget in 3 years. But no longer technically bankrupt describes a specific legal status. It doesn't describe a city with meaningful surplus capacity to absorb unexpected financial risk from an international event running on an uncertain budget. Against that exact backdrop, Birmingham City Council spent approximately £30 million securing hosting rights for Invictus 2027, a decision that's generated significant vocal public opposition. A petition calling for outright cancellation has circulated among residents, built around a fairly straightforward argument. The council cut local services, closed facilities, reduced staffing across departments residents depend on daily, and then committed tens of millions to host an international event attached to a high-profile couple.
Him out of Invictus, he did not raise the $25 million that he needed to. Now, meanwhile, he also went and kind of almost exactly copied William.
One local source put it bluntly: Birmingham is effectively broke and can't afford these games. The council's counterargument is that hosting generates economic return, contributing to recovery, which has real logic behind it. International events do generate hospitality spending and tourism. The Commonwealth Games made exactly that same case. The Commonwealth Games also left a £184 million weight on a council that collapsed into bankruptcy the following year. The irony here is hard to avoid stating directly. The city chosen to host an event facing a £40 million funding crisis is itself a city that spent 3 years in its own financial crisis. Now, let's go into what the actual charity filings show, because this is the part almost nobody covering this story has actually read.
So we know he is going to Birmingham this summer to prep for the games next year. And one of the reasons he's going is because he needs money.
Everything in this next section comes directly from the Invictus Games Foundation's own submissions to the UK Charity Commission. Not speculation, not anonymous claims, legally required regulatory filings publicly available to anyone who looks. Start with the most direct measure of what a veteran-facing charity actually does with its money: grants distributed to veteran organizations. In the Foundation's 2024 filings, direct grants totaled £200,328. The year before, that figure was £534,973, a reduction of 63% in the direct money reaching the veteran groups the Foundation exists to serve. Now hold that next to everything else happening in the same financial period. Total Foundation income rose 41% in 2024. Cash reserves grew to £2.3 million. A new six-figure executive role was added to the staff structure. Deferred income, money received but not yet spent, increased fourfold, from £431,000 to £1.79 million.
Quite a moving return for these guys. One of our guys who worked at the Foundation, Josh, went back and found his clinician who literally saved his life. Wow. He hadn't been back for 13 or 15 years.
The Foundation was growing. Income up, reserves up, executive structure expanding, and direct money reaching veteran organizations fell by 63% in that exact same window. That's a documented pattern sitting directly in the Foundation's own official numbers, filed with a UK regulator, not alleged by any outside critic. And it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question that the filings themselves never actually answer anywhere. In a year of demonstrably rising income across nearly every other category, what specifically drove the decision to cut the most direct, tangible form of veteran support by more than half? There's more. Legal fees recorded in the 2024 filings jumped from £45,000 to £150,000. More than a threefold increase in a single year, with no explanation appearing anywhere in the public-facing filing. Then there's a payment of approximately £30,000 to an American for-profit company called Dunes LLC. The filing records the payment. It doesn't record the purpose. No description of services, no explanation of the relationship, no account of what the money was actually for. In the following year's filing, that payment simply doesn't appear at all, with no explanation given for its disappearance either. The Foundation publicly states that 92% of every pound received goes toward charitable activities, a figure used repeatedly in public communications as evidence of responsible stewardship. It sounds reassuring, but the definition of charitable activities as applied here matters enormously. It encompasses running the games themselves, venue logistics, staff salaries, executive compensation, travel, broadcast infrastructure, event operations. Those are all real costs tied to a real event. They're simply not the same thing as direct grants or direct services reaching veterans. The 92% figure and the £200,000 in direct veteran grants can both be true simultaneously. The filings confirm they are. For scale context, Vancouver 2025 cost approximately $63.2 million Canadian dollars for 543 competing athletes. The US Warrior Games, a comparable competition, operates on roughly $2 million a year. Germany runs an equivalent national competition for approximately $200,000. None of this appears in the Charity Commission filings, but it frames the scale of operational expenditure the Foundation's fundraising is expected to sustain. None of this individually proves wrongdoing. That word genuinely doesn't belong here, because the filings themselves don't establish it. What the filings do establish is a clear pattern: rising income, growing reserves, climbing executive costs, tripling legal fees without explanation, an unexplained payment to an unidentified American company that vanishes the following year without comment. And throughout all of it, the direct money reaching the veteran organizations, the Foundation was created to serve falling by nearly 2/3. But the money trail isn't the only signal worth watching. There's what the people closest to this organization are actually doing, separate from anything anyone's saying publicly. Melanie Poole was vice chairman of the Birmingham 2027 Board of Trustees. She's resigned from that post. Before Invictus, she held senior positions at the Heritage Lottery Fund, the National Lottery Charities Board, and the Florence Nightingale Foundation. Not peripheral roles, but a sustained record of serious institutional leadership at the highest levels of UK charitable governance. Poole is exactly the kind of figure whose board presence signals to regulators, funders, and corporate partners that governance infrastructure is credible and stable. She chose to leave anyway, with no public explanation given during a period of sustained public scrutiny of the foundation's finances. That resignation doesn't stand alone either. Recruitment sources familiar with the staffing situation describe a pattern extending well beyond one board departure. Qualified event professionals, people with the specific experience required to deliver a multi-nation international competition at this scale, are actively declining job offers once they learn the employer's identity. According to one described process, initial recruitment conversations don't name the employer. When candidates eventually push for that information, and experienced senior professionals invariably do, and the answer comes back as Invictus, the conversation simply ends. One source described it directly. Once the recruitment team confirmed it was Invictus, the answer was no, straight away. That's not an abstract perception problem. It's a recruitment problem with direct operational consequences. 15 months from an opening ceremony that requires experienced senior people in place early enough to actually build functioning systems. Here's why all of this matters beyond just one event, though. This is genuinely the last major platform Harry has left. Look at everything that preceded this. Send to Bali, the charity he co-founded supporting children affected by HIV in southern Africa, ended in early 2025 when Harry stepped down as patron following what was described as an irreparable breakdown with the organization's chairman. Archewell Foundation, the vehicle meant to anchor the Sussex philanthropic identity. 2024 filings show $7.5 million in total expenses against $3.1 million in donations collected, with $1.8 million distributed in grants, spending more than double what was raised, with grants representing less than a quarter of total expenditure. African Parks became entangled in governance allegations that damaged both the organization's credibility and Harry's own association with it. The Netflix partnership, publicly valued at a reported $100 million at announcement, has reportedly underperformed significantly against original projections. Spotify ended without renewal. Public speaking income has reportedly contracted sharply. What remains is Invictus specifically, the one platform carrying genuine institutional credibility, the one association that isn't primarily about the Sussexes themselves, that exists for the actual benefit of wounded and ill veterans whose service and recovery are entirely real regardless of anything else happening around the organization. It's worth being fair here for a moment before closing, because not every troubling number in a charity filing automatically points to bad intent. Growing charities frequently see legal costs rise as they scale. Executive structures sometimes genuinely need to expand to handle increased operational complexity, and reserve growth can reflect prudent long-term planning rather than anything sinister. The specific combination documented here: falling direct grants alongside rising income and reserves, an unexplained payment that simply vanishes the following year, tripled legal fees with no accompanying explanation, is what makes this particular pattern worth real scrutiny rather than routine growing pains. Reasonable people reviewing the same filings could still land on different conclusions about intent, even while agreeing on what the numbers themselves actually show, which is exactly why what's happening to this specific organization matters this much, beyond just one event's balance sheet. This isn't simply an event that needs to raise £33 million in 15 months. It's the last credible platform standing, and if it collapses under the weight of everything documented here, the question that follows is the one nobody's wanted to ask directly. What comes after? The £40 million gap isn't mathematically impossible to close in the time remaining. Deals that size have been assembled faster before. But closing it requires focused, unglamorous, executive-level work happening in rooms without cameras or narrative management. And it requires the organization's public face to genuinely be the competitors rather than the founders. Whether that shift happens in time is the only question that actually matters now, because the veterans training today didn't create any of this situation, and they're the ones who'll pay the most direct price if it isn't resolved. What do you genuinely think? Can this specific funding gap realistically close in the 15 months remaining? Or is Birmingham 2027 already too far behind, financially and structurally, to fully recover from where it currently stands? And do you think Harry stepping back from the public-facing role specifically could actually help close that sponsor gap? Or is the damage to the brand already too deep at this point regardless of who's fronting it? Drop your honest read in the comments, subscribe to Palace Insider if you want the next update on this the moment it happens, and I'll see you in the next one.